Hi guys, this is chapter 8, key issue 1. Let me just get it going here. Okay, so you are doing a different thing for homework. You're doing your organizer. And again, like not all of that is going to be chapter 8, key issue 1. You're going to have to look kind of throughout chapter 8 for some of that stuff. But you are still doing the key issue 1 lecture along with that. So that's what this is. Okay, so today is mostly about states versus nations. What's the difference? Okay. We'll talk a little bit about how we use the word country and nation interchangeably, which is incorrect. And you can correct your teachers next year who say something different. And then we'll talk a little bit about extensions of states like colonies and imperialism. So that is what's on the docket for today. Okay, so first of all, states. Is Nevada a state or is Canada a state? Well, actually, the way we use the word country in the U.S., actually, we're talking about states. Now, it's really confusing because the United States, we use our smaller organization within our country. We call those states, like Canada calls them provinces, and different countries will call them different things. But since we call it states, it gets really confusing. But basically, between Nevada and Canada would be a state, okay? So a state is a country, okay? And so the definition says an area organized into a political unit and ruled by an established government with control over its internal and foreign affairs. So basically what's really important about a state is a state has borders, for one thing, okay? There is a territory, there's a clearly defined territory that belongs to a state. Everything outside of those borders is not part of that state. Okay, and there's some sort of government, which can take many forms, but there's some sort of government controlling everything within that state. Okay, so the key to a state is sovereignty, meaning that the state governs itself. So like the state has power over itself, right? The U.S. has a government. There's no other governments in the world that can take over the U.S. government, right? Like we have our own power in the U.S. What happens in Germany, let's say, they can't tell us what to do. We have our own power, right? So really the 50 states of the U.S. are more like subdivisions within a single state, that single state being the U.S., right? I know, really confusing because we use the word state kind of in a different way in this country. There are 193 states recognized by the UN, which is the United Nations, which is a supranational organization, which we are going to talk about, and you're reading a little bit about for your organizer. Okay, we're not going to really talk about it in this lecture. We're going to talk about it in a later lecture. Okay, so that's a state, and then there are different types of states. So, one more thing really quick. So states are the building blocks of our political map, right? So all of these things, let me get my pointer here. All of these are different states. Mongolia is a state, China is a state, Russia is a state. Together they make up the continent of Asia, right? So the building blocks of our political map are states, okay? Stop calling them countries, they're states. Okay, there's other types of states, however. So there are city-states, which is more like when a city operates as a state. So a city that has its own borders, has its own government, and has its own sovereignty, meaning that other outside forces don't control that, okay? So some examples of city-states would be Athens in Greece. In ancient Greece, Athens today is not a city-state, but it used to operate like a city-state. Athens had its own government and its own sovereignty. The Vatican would be another example. The Vatican, where the Pope lives, is considered its own city. And even though it's in Rome, so it's in Italy, the Italian government doesn't have control over the Vatican. So since they're sovereign, they have their own power, that is considered a city-state. So there's a couple of examples for you. There is a part nation state, and we're going to talk about nations in a second, and that's a state whose population is only part of a nation. Okay, so we're going to talk about what a nation is, but sometimes we refer to the Arab nation, meaning lots of countries in the Middle East. So like Egypt is an example. It's part of the Arab nation, but is also its own state. Does that make sense? Libya is part of the Arab nation, but also Libya is a state. Okay? A multinational state is a state whose population is made up of 2 or more nations. Okay? This is going to get real confusing. But basically, the UK has British people, if you want to call Britain a nation. But technically, the UK also includes Ireland and Scotland. So multinational. The USSR, which is now we call, so Russia, when it was in control of lots of smaller states that are independent today, like Albania, Estonia, because it was one large state made up of a bunch of different groups, that was called a multinational state. In a lot of ways, I think the US could almost be considered a multinational state. We'll talk about that in a bit. Okay. Other types of states. One is a stateless nation. So that's a nation that has no state. Okay? So actually, I think we're going to do this. Let me go to nations first, and I'm going to come back to stateless nations. Otherwise, I think this won't make as much sense. So we'll come back to, ooh, I went backwards. Okay, so states are countries. They have borders that are clearly defined. Everything within that border is within the power of that state. No other state has power over the decisions another state makes, technically. Nations are different. So a nation really isn't a state at all, although sometimes you can be both. A nation is a group of people with a shared cultural identity or a set of cultural characteristics. Okay? So sometimes we talk about like Raider Nation. So that's all of the unification of all the people who call themselves Raiders fans, right? That's a nation, okay? Let's see. Arab countries might call themselves the Arab nation. The Islamic State, even though they use that incorrectly, they're talking about a united place where all people who practice Islam are united, okay? So a nation has more to do with your cultural identity than it does with your actual country, okay? So that's what a nation is. Now here it gets real tricky. A nation state. A nation state is a state whose territory corresponds to that occupied by a particular ethnicity that has been transformed into a nationality. In other words, so that is when within the state is a unified nation. So an example would be Denmark. Everybody who lives in Denmark is a Dane, right? That's what you call people in Denmark. Slovenia. Everyone who is in Slovenia considers themselves the same cultural identity, okay? Let's see. Another one would be Japan would be another one. Everybody in Japan is Japanese. Here's some other examples that wouldn't work. The United States. We often call ourselves a nation, but we're actually kind of not, because we have lots of different cultures. We're this amalgam of lots of different cultures and lots of different religious beliefs that speak lots of different languages. So we're really not a nation in that regard. So in a nation, you kind of need this uniformity. And here's the other part that's kind of tricky. Nations don't necessarily have borders unless you're a nation state, okay? So even though I might be a Raiders fan in Nevada, and I'm not, by the way, just to clarify, just an example, and there's one in Pennsylvania, we're in different states, or maybe I should let's do it this way. Let's say there's a person in Canada that also likes the Raiders. Then we're in different states, but we're still in the same nation because we have that commonality, okay? So real quick, let's go back to stateless nations now. So a stateless nation is a group of people who have some sort of common identity, but they do not have a homeland, okay? So an example would be the Palestinians. There is a country of Palestine. However, Israel and Palestine are in a lot of territorial disputes right now. So whether or not they have a home is a little bit unclear. You're going to do an activity in about a week or so where you're going to practice kind of wrap your heads around what's going on in Israel. It's a complicated situation. The Kurds mostly exist in Turkey and then in northern Iraq. So they're kind of spread around that geographic area, but they don't have their own country. What they've been proposing for a long time is to take part of Turkey and to take part of Iraq and make a Kurdistan so that they would have their own country. And then the Chechens, Chechnya is a region in Russia, but it's not its own state. So they have also been asking for their own state for a very long time. This is why Israel was created, because the Jews before were considered a stateless nation, and now they have Israel as their state. And I just had another, your CGA 3, the Rohingya are also considered a stateless nation. That's another one you could add. They live mostly in Myanmar, but obviously are not welcome there and are different than what is preferred, I guess I would say. So they don't really have a homeland either. Okay? All right. Pretty complex stuff. Okay, so now let's go into these would be extensions of states, okay? So we're having a little bit of a history lesson along with our geography lesson here today. So colonies is a territory that is legally tied to a sovereign state rather than completely independent. So you guys have had history lessons in this before. Before the U.S. was the U.S., we were a British colony. We were considered part of Britain, okay? We were an extension of that state, okay? The reason they speak, we've talked about this before, the reason they speak Spanish largely in South America is because most of South America was part of a Spanish colony, right? It was an extension of Spain, except for Brazil, for example, extension of Portugal, right? Golly, the hiccups. And then so that whole period was called the colonial period. Colonialism as a verb is the attempt by one country to establish settlements and to impose its political, economic, and cultural principles in another territory. Okay? Now, this continued, so sort of like lots of countries get their independence around the same time that the U.S. does. But then it will continue a little bit later. So the colonial era, what we're talking about, is in the 1400s mostly. The reasons that Britain and Spain and France wanted colonies was mostly to make money. Also to spread Christianity. The money I'm talking about comes from resources, things like gold. And the more colonies you had, the more your bragging rights were. So if you had a lot of colonies, you were way more powerful. So, of course, who doesn't like that? And then in the 1700s and 1800s, a lot of colonies get their independence. Okay? There used to be the saying, the sun never set on the British Empire, meaning no matter where you were in the world, there was a British colony somewhere. Britain had a lot of colonies. Lots and lots and lots of colonies. Okay. And this is an example. These are all the countries that Britain invaded. So everything but the white-ish areas. So yes, not to say that they had all of these as colonies, but they at least attempted to colonize all of these places. And a lot of them, they were, in fact, successful. So imperialism is almost the more modern period of colonialism. So this takes place in the late 19th century, so the late 1800s. This time the U.S. was a colonizer and not colonized. This is also called the Scramble for Africa, which you're going to see in a little bit, but this just shows you, this just shows you so Great Britain had all of those countries, France had all of these areas, okay? So the same thing, and basically for the same reasons, not so much to spread religion this time, but again, it was for resources. The Industrial Revolution had taken place, so you needed a lot of resources to keep your factories and things like that running. So, okay, Scramble for Africa, this is what I'm talking about. And when you watched Rwanda, Hotel Rwanda, a lot of their problems have to do with the Scramble for Africa. So, this was all French Africa. Anything that's light pink was British. Anything that's kind of that minty color was Italian. And so, this would eventually become part of Rwanda right here, okay? So the Belgians had taken over, remember, and they separated the Rwandans, who would one day become Rwandans, into Hutus and Tutsis and things like that. So that's one example. But basically, many of the problems that take place in Africa today, many of the problems that take place in the Middle East today, have to do with this imperialism period where they were controlled by European powers, and one day all of the European powers up and left, and they were left to their own devices, having not been educated in how democratic governments work, or any governments of any sort, really, except for dictatorships. That's kind of what they were used to. So we're going to talk a lot about that this year. Okay, and then that's just another example, colonial world in 1914. So this would be considered part of the imperialism period. Yeah, lots and lots of different places. Controlled not by their own people, but by European and sometimes American powers. Okay, so imperialism ends after World War II because all of the big powers of the world are pretty much broke and can't afford to run their land holdings anymore. So they give up a lot of them. Asian and African UN members, so independent countries that joined the United Nations in 1945, it's 15. By 2010, it's 106. Okay. And there's still some areas that are kind of considered colonies. Puerto Rico might be an example. I don't know, that might be kind of controversial to say. Anywho, okay, we're going to do key issue 2 later. So hopefully you guys took some good notes. This is kind of one of those chapters you have to write a lot down because your book just doesn't give you enough information. So there will definitely be lots of pop quiz questions on this, so get ready for that. Okie smoky. Have a good day.